What if one of the most debated figures in history wasn't just a matter of faith, but a matter of fact? In a world where legends often outshine reality, few names have been argued over as fiercely as Jesus of Nazareth. Was he the Son of God, a revolutionary teacher, or just a story told for 2,000 years? Mel Gibson, in a candid conversation on the Joe Rogan Experience, didn't just share his faith, he brought up evidence. Not vague theories, but physical artifacts, ancient writings, and historical records that stubbornly refuse to disappear. Proof that challenges the comfortable idea that Jesus might be nothing more than myth. Archaeological stones bearing the names of his accusers. Burial boxes linked to his family. Ancient Roman decrees responding to whispers of an empty tomb. Even non-Christian historians documenting his execution and the strange movement that followed. Some of this you might have heard, but not like this. Today, we're going to piece it together. The history, the discoveries, and the stories, to see just how strong the case really is. And along the way, we'll ask the questions skeptics avoid and believers sometimes take for granted. Because if Jesus truly walked this earth, then every word he spoke about forgiveness, justice, and eternal life is not just an idea. It's a reality we all have to face. So, let's open the evidence box. When people talk about Jesus, the conversation usually splits in two. One group sees him purely through the lens of faith, a divine figure whose life is beyond the reach of historical proof. The other insists he's an invention, a story crafted to inspire or control. But what happens when we strip away the opinions and look at the cold, hard record left behind? Surprisingly, historians, even those who don't believe in the supernatural, generally agree on one point. Jesus of Nazareth existed. He lived in the small Roman province of Judea around the 1st century, taught publicly, clashed with religious authorities, and was executed under the authority of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. That's the baseline. The debate isn't whether he lived, but who he really was. And here's where the evidence becomes fascinating. Mel Gibson, in his Joe Rogan Experience interview, dropped a striking comparison. More than 40 ancient sources mention Jesus directly. By contrast, Emperor Tiberius, ruler of the entire Roman Empire during most of Jesus' lifetime, appears in only about 10 sources. That's a 4-to-1 ratio in favor of a carpenter from an obscure village, with no political power, no army, and no monuments in his honor. Why would that happen? The only logical explanation is that his life, and the movement it sparked, disrupted history far beyond what his humble origins would suggest. You don't end up in the records of both your supporters and your enemies unless you made waves. The Pilate Stone, history etched in rock. One of the most famous archaeological finds connected to the Gospels is the Pilate Stone. Unearthed in 1961 in Caesarea Maritima, it's a block of limestone with an inscription in Latin, confirming that Pontius Pilate was indeed the prefect of Judea during the reign of Tiberius. It might sound like a small detail, but think about it. This is an external, physical artifact that lines up perfectly with the biblical narrative. Pilate wasn't a figure invented for the story. He was real, in power, and in the exact position to authorize Jesus' crucifixion. For skeptics, this means the gospel authors didn't just pull names out of thin air. The Caiaphas Ossuary, the accuser's name in stone. Fast forward to 1990. Archaeologists in Jerusalem discover a beautifully decorated limestone bone box, an ossuary, inscribed with the words, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Historical and gospel records both name Caiaphas as the high priest who presided over Jesus' trial. The ossuary contained the remains of a man about 60 years old, consistent with Caiaphas' likely age during the events of the Gospels. For Mel Gibson, this artifact became a teaching moment with his young daughter. He showed her the box and explained who Caiaphas was. Her response was simple but sharp. If the accuser existed, the accused probably did too. That's the kind of reasoning we often overlook in modern debates, sometimes. It's not about a dramatic, all-encompassing proof. It's about a network of consistent, interlocking facts that leave less and less room for the maybe he never existed theory. The James Ouary family ties. Another intriguing find emerged in 2002. The so-called James Ouary, inscribed in Aramaic, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. The authenticity of the inscription has been hotly debated, with accusations of forgery followed by scientific tests that suggest the patina, the mineral layer formed over centuries, is consistent with the 1st century, even if the box's exact origin remains contested. The combination of names is statistically rare in the same family. Historian André Lemaire estimated that only about 20 men in Judea could have had that exact name combination during that period. That doesn't make it definitive proof, but it certainly makes it worth paying attention to. Why these finds matter. Skeptics sometimes argue that ancient texts are unreliable because they were written decades after the events. That's why archaeology is so important. It doesn't prove every miracle, but it can confirm the cultural and political landscape the Gospels describe. When you combine the Pilate Stone, the Caiaphas Ossuary, and possibly the James Ouary, you get a tangible web of connections to the people directly involved in Jesus' final days. It's like finding the supporting cast of a historical drama, one artifact at a time. And here's a thought: if all these secondary figures were real, in the exact time and place the Gospels say they were, how much harder is it to argue that the central figure was entirely fictional? This is just the surface. We haven't even touched the discoveries that bring you within arm's reach of the world Jesus walked in. The fishing boats, the streets, the execution methods. If the stones can tell us this much, imagine what the buried cities and forgotten artifacts can reveal. In the next section, we'll step even closer to the streets of Galilee, the pools where miracles were said to happen, and the chilling archaeological evidence of Roman crucifixion itself. Once you have names like Pilate and Caiaphas carved in stone, the next question becomes, what about the places? Can we actually find the physical settings described in the Gospels? The answer is yes. And the more archaeologists dig, the more the 1st century world of Jesus comes into focus. The boat from the Sea of Galilee. In 1986, during a severe drought, 2 fishermen spotted the outline of an ancient boat embedded in the mud near the Sea of Galilee. Archaeologists rushed to preserve it, discovering it was a fishing vessel from the 1st century, the exact type that Peter, Andrew, James, and John would have used. It's not the boat of Jesus, but it doesn't need to be. Its worn wooden planks, patched and repaired over decades, give us a tactile glimpse into the life of the fishermen Jesus called to be his disciples. Mel Gibson used research like this when shooting The Passion of the Christ, making sure every object on screen, from fishing nets to Roman armor, felt authentic. For viewers, these finds do more than verify history. They shrink the distance between a story in a book and a real world you could step into. The pools of Bethesda and Siloam. The Gospel of John describes 2 healing events in specific locations. The Pool of Bethesda, where Jesus healed a paralyzed man, and the Pool of Siloam, where he sent a blind man to wash his eyes. Skeptics long dismissed Bethesda as fictional, until archaeologists found it in Jerusalem, complete with its unusual 5 porticos. Exactly as described in John 5, the Pool of Siloam was uncovered in 2004 during sewage repairs, revealing a broad set of stone steps leading down to a water reservoir. These aren't just Bible places. They're verifiable public spaces that existed in Jesus' time, making the gospel accounts less like myth and more like eyewitness reportage. Roman crucifixion, the archaeological evidence. The crucifixion of Jesus is the central moment of the Christian story, but for centuries, no physical evidence of crucifixion in the Roman world had been found. That changed in 1968 when a team in Jerusalem unearthed the remains of a man named Yehohanan, crucified in the 1st century. His heel bone still had a long iron nail driven through it, bent at the tip, probably because it struck a knot in the wood. This find confirmed several things. Romans did nail victims to crosses, not just tie them. Nails went through the ankles or wrists, not the palms, for structural support. Crucifixion left lasting physical traces that match the gospel descriptions. Mel Gibson incorporated this detail into The Passion of the Christ with surgical precision, depicting nails driven through the wrists and the brutal whipping with a flagrum, a whip tipped with metal or bone, also known from archaeological finds. The Nazareth Inscription, a Roman response. One of the most curious pieces of the puzzle is a marble slab discovered in 1878, now called the Nazareth Inscription. Written in Greek, it's a decree from Emperor Claudius threatening death to anyone who disturbs graves or removes bodies from sealed tombs. The slab is dated to within 2 decades of Jesus' crucifixion. While it doesn't mention him by name, many scholars think it's connected to early Christian claims of the resurrection. or to Jewish leaders' accusations that the disciples stole his body. In other words, Rome may have been legislating against a story that was already spreading like wildfire. Why these places and objects matter. Imagine reading a novel, then finding out the streets, landmarks, and side characters are all real. Even if you doubt the more extraordinary parts of the story, it forces you to reconsider whether the central figure was invented. When you stand in the Pool of Siloam or walk the streets of Capernaum, you're literally in the footprint of the Gospels. These discoveries make the biblical text more than a religious document. They transform it into a map you can follow. But there's another side to the evidence, the written record, not just from believers, but from those who didn't follow Jesus at all, Romans, Jews, and political leaders who had no reason to invent him. In the next section, we'll open that archive and see what his enemies and outsiders had to say, and why their words may be even harder to dismiss than the miracles. The New Testament as early testimony. For many people, the Gospels are first and foremost religious texts, but when historians analyze them, they also function as historical documents, preserved surprisingly close to the events they describe. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written between roughly 70 and 90 AD, but their content draws from oral traditions and earlier sources circulating within a generation of Jesus' life. The Gospel of Luke even opens with a statement that the author investigated the events carefully, speaking to eyewitnesses. Certain details in the Gospels, like the use of Aramaic phrases, Talitha cum, little girl, get up, and the naming of obscure local figures, are exactly the kind of things historians see in authentic eyewitness reporting. They don't read like myths polished over centuries, they read like memories. Then there are the letters of Paul, written as early as AD 50, within just 2 decades of the crucifixion. Paul didn't know Jesus in person, but he spoke directly with Peter, John, and James, the brother of Jesus. It were leaders who did. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lists a chain of witnesses to the resurrection, including more than 500 people, many of whom were still alive when he wrote it. This is essentially Paul saying, "You don't believe me? Go ask them." Non-Christian Roman sources. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around AD 116, records that Christus, the founder of the Christian movement, was executed by Pontius Pilate under Emperor Tiberius. Tacitus calls Christianity a dangerous superstition, so he's not promoting the faith. He's simply noting it as a historical fact, which makes his record even more credible to skeptics. Suetonius, another Roman writer, mentions disturbances in Rome linked to someone called Christus during Emperor Claudius's reign. Most scholars agree this refers to disputes involving early Christians. Again, this is only 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death, showing that his influence had already reached the empire's capital. Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia around AD 111, writes to Emperor Trajan about Christians who sing hymns to Christ as to a god. He's not debating whether Jesus existed. He's reporting a growing movement that's becoming a problem for Roman authorities. Jewish sources. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the late 1st century, makes 2 references to Jesus. In one, he briefly describes James as the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, executed by stoning. This short mention is direct, factual, and uncontroversial, and it firmly ties Jesus to a real family line. The other, more famous passage, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, describes Jesus as a wise man who performed surprising deeds and was crucified under Pilate. Some phrases in this text were likely added by later Christian copyists, but most scholars agree that the core of the statement is original to Josephus. In other words, even a Jewish historian who didn't follow Jesus acknowledged his existence and execution. Why enemy testimony matters. When someone who disagrees with you confirms your core facts, it carries weight. Tacitus had no incentive to invent Jesus. Josephus wasn't trying to strengthen the Christian case. Pliny certainly wasn't preaching the gospel, yet they all acknowledged him. This is why historians, even those with no religious belief, generally reject the idea that Jesus was a complete myth. It's not because they've been swayed by theology, but because the cumulative record is too wide, too early, and too interconnected to dismiss. Mel Gibson made a point in his interview. Facts alone don't create faith. You can pile up all the archaeology, all the ancient texts, and still not convince someone to follow Jesus. What the evidence does is remove excuses. If Jesus really lived, taught, and died as these sources say, the next question isn't did he exist, but what do I do with that reality? That's where the conversation shifts from history to personal decision. We've looked at the stones, the bones, and the scrolls, but one more piece of evidence remains, not locked in a museum or an archive, but written in the lives of people who were there. People who went from hiding in fear to proclaiming the resurrection at the cost of their own lives. And it's here that history meets something harder to explain away. Up to now, we've seen Jesus in history's spotlight, a real man whose name shows up in inscriptions, official decrees, and even the writings of those who opposed him. But here's where the story takes a leap. It's one thing to believe Jesus lived and died. It's another to explain why his followers didn't just keep his memory alive. They rewrote history around the claim that he rose from the dead. When Jesus was arrested, the Gospels paint a humiliating picture of his closest friends. They ran. Peter, arguably his boldest disciple, denied even knowing him 3 times. The group scattered, hiding from the same authorities who had just crucified their leader. And yet, within weeks, those same men were publicly proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. Not cautiously, not anonymously. They preached it in Jerusalem, the very city where he had been executed, to crowds that included people who had seen him die. What changed? Skeptics sometimes argue that the disciples fabricated the resurrection story. But what's the payoff for sticking to a lie that gets you beaten, imprisoned, or executed? Liars make terrible martyrs. Paul's letter to the Corinthians contains what scholars call an early creed, recited by the first Christians before the New Testament was even written. Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures. He was buried. He was raised on the 3rd day. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living. This isn't decades-old tradition. Most scholars date it to within a few years, even months, of the crucifixion. In the ancient world, that's lightning fast for such a core belief to be fully formed. If the resurrection was just a feel-good legend, it shouldn't have survived its first generation. The early Christians had no political influence, no military, no wealth. What they did have was conviction, and it spread like fire through the dry grass of the Roman Empire. By AD 64, Christians were present in Rome itself, so numerous that Emperor Nero could scapegoat them for the great fire of the city. Pliny the Younger would later write about entire communities in Asia Minor meeting regularly to worship Jesus as a god. This growth happened not in safety but in the shadow of persecution. And it's this very pressure that often strengthens a movement. Weeds are easy to pull, but deep roots grow stronger when tested. We touched earlier on the Nazareth Inscription, the marble slab warning against grave robbing with the death penalty. Its timing, within 2 decades of the crucifixion, is compelling. Imagine a government response to a rumor so disruptive that it warranted an empire-wide legal threat. Whether or not it was directly aimed at the Christian claim, it shows the Roman world was already reacting to a story that refused to fade. One of the more human arguments for the resurrection's early impact is simply this: people rarely suffer willingly for what they know to be false. Conspiracies unravel fast when stakes get high. The apostles endured flogging, exile, stoning, and execution. They didn't get riches or political offices in return. They got scars and graves. If they were inventing the resurrection, they picked the worst possible business plan. In just 300 years, Christianity went from an illegal sect meeting in private homes to the official religion of the Roman Empire. That kind of growth is nearly impossible without something powerful driving it. Historian Larry Hurtado described the rise of Christianity as a mutant phenomenon in the ancient religious world, exploding in size while breaking all the rules of how religions usually spread. Its center wasn't a temple, its rituals weren't tied to one location, and its founder was a condemned criminal. And yet, it took over the empire. Mel Gibson put it simply in his interview: "Facts don't create faith, but they remove excuses." If Jesus didn't rise, then the disciples were either deceived or deceivers. But the record, both written and archaeological, shows they acted as men convinced of what they saw, willing to die for it. That doesn't prove the resurrection like a math equation, but it leaves you with a choice. You can dismiss them all as mistaken or lying, or you can take seriously the possibility that they were telling the truth. Either way, the evidence forces the conversation beyond wishful thinking. So here's where everything comes together. The stones, the texts, the eyewitnesses, the movement. In the conclusion, we'll step back and look at the big picture, not just whether Jesus existed, but why it matters for you today. Because if it's all true, then the greatest question in history isn't did he live? It's what will you do with him now? We've sifted through artifacts, combed ancient records, and followed a trail that winds from dusty tombs to imperial decrees. But the real weight of all this isn't in the stones or the scrolls. It's in the question they leave hanging in the air. Now that you've seen this, what will you do with it? Historical evidence can convince you that Jesus lived. It can even bring you to the edge of believing he was more than just another teacher. But history has a limit. At some point, the decision stops being about dates and inscriptions and starts being about you. And that's where the story becomes uncomfortably personal. Because if Jesus really stepped into our world, it means his words weren't just for crowds in Judea 2,000 years ago. They're for you, now. His calls to forgive, to stand for the outcast, to live with integrity. They demand a response in the way you treat the people in your life today. That's the challenge the early Christians took seriously. They didn't spread the message to win arguments. They lived it, often at great cost. And that might be the part of their legacy that survives the longest. Not just the claims they made, but the way they carried themselves because of those claims. You may walk away from this convinced that the evidence for Jesus is solid, or you might still have doubts. Both are honest places to start. What matters is whether you're willing to keep asking the harder questions. If he lived, if he meant what he said, what does that require of me? That's not an easy question, but it's the only one worth wrestling with after all the history is laid bare. So here's my invitation. Don't let this just be a history lesson you file away. Let it be a conversation starter. With yourself, with friends, with anyone willing to talk about things that matter more than comfort. Because if the story is true, ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. It only delays the moment you have to face it. Just maybe, that's the moment that could change everything.